So, does everybody remember the Ptolemies? You know, Cleopatra was mentioned last year as a big part of Egypt. And of course, the Ptolemies at one point conquered Egypt. But something that they never tell you about is that the Ptolemies wrote about Egypt. And when they wrote about Egypt, they mentioned something very strange. Something that makes it sound like the native Egyptians were not part of the species or race of the Ptolemaic people. Something that makes it sound like the native Egyptians are a foreign group of people to the Ptolemaics. But not only that, they wrote about the Ethiopians, the Garamantes, and they all describe these people as the same group and belonging to the same land. But I will prove this again by reading Ptolemy Geography, written in the 2nd century. So I will show you maps. You look at this, these are global maps showing that the world is spherical and done in a curvy shape rather than a flat shape, which is being described by Ptolemy in this section using mathematics. But I will double down and say that after he does this, he then separates Ethiopia from Asia and he uses the Gulf, which is that little sea ocean between Ethiopia and Arabia, which means that he again disputes this idea that the Nile cuts Ethiopia. So something you hear people say all the time is Ethiopia is south of Egypt. What they're mistaking is when these people, and you're going to see he writes this down as well, when they say Ethiopia is south of Egypt, they don't say that. They say Ethiopia south of Egypt in the same way that I would say something like Europe east of Greece. It doesn't mean that Greece isn't part of Europe. It just means that I'm talking about that area east of Greece. And the reason they did this was because Libya, right? So they say Ethiopia south of Libya or Ethiopia south of Egypt. Those places were considered a different empire to the people down below. It wasn't because they were considered a different race. And again, you will see it will be written down. He starts off by saying, Marinus infers that he himself determined by mathematics proof that the Orion is entirely visible before the summer solstice to those who dwell below the equatorial circle. Also that with them the dog star rises before Procyon, which he says is observed as far south even as Syene. In these conclusions of Marian, there is nothing appropriate or of value to us because he extends the position of his inhabited countries too far south of the equator. In computing the days one by one, occupied in journeying from Leptis Magna to Agas Symbia, Marinus shows that the latter locality is 24,680 stadia south of the equator. By adding together the days occupied in sailing from Ptolemais, Troglodytia to Presum, he concluded that Presum is 27,800 stadia south of the equator. And from these data, he infers that the promontory of Presum and the land of Agasimbia, which, as he himself expresses, it belongs to Ethiopia and is not the end of Ethiopia, lies on the south coast in the frigid zone opposite to ours. In southerly direction, 27,000 stadia make up 55 and 34 degrees, and this number of degrees in an opposite direction marks a like temperature climate and the region of the swamp Meotis, which the Scythians and the Sarmatians inhabit. Marinus then reduces the stated number of his stadia by half or less than half, that is to 12,000, which is about the distance of the winter solstice from the equatorial circle. The only reason for this reduction that he gives us is the deviation from a straight line of the journeys and their daily variation in length. After he has stated these reasons, it seems to us necessary not only to show that he was mistaken, but also to reduce his figures by the required one half. At the outset, when writing of the journey from Garama to Ethiopia, he says that Septimus Flaccus, having set out from Libya with his army, came to the land of Ethiopians from the land of Garamantes in the space of 3 months by journeying continuously southward. He says furthermore that Julius Metrinus, setting out from Leptis Magna and Garama with the king of the Garamantes, who was beginning an expedition against the Ethiopians by bearing continuously southwards, came within 4 months of Agasimba, the country of Ethiopians, where the rhinoceros is to be found. Each of these statements on the face is incredible. First, because the Ethiopians are not so far distance from the Garamantes as to require to a 3 month journey, seeing that the Garamantes are themselves, for the most part, Ethiopians and have the same king. Secondly, because it is ridiculous to think that the king should march through regions subject to him only in a southerly direction, when the inhabitants of those regions are scattered widely east and west, and ridiculous also that he should never have made a single halt that would alter the reckoning. Wherefore, we conclude that it is not unreasonable to suppose that those men either spoke in hyperbole, or else, as rustics say, to the south or towards Africa, to those who prefer to be deceived by them rather than take the pains of assertion the truth. So you read that right there. Basically, he is countering this guy who writes about the Ethiopians and tries to put them deep in the south of the equator and says, why are you doing this? And remember, Ptolemy is in Africa. The Ptolemies are in Egypt, and they're saying this is incorrect. The Garamantes, remember, Herodotus said this before, the Garamantes are Ethiopians. And he says, for the most part, the Garamantes are Ethiopians. And so what he's saying here is, why are you trying to separate the Garamantes from the Ethiopians? And then he even goes further and says they have the same king, meaning that they belong to the same empire. And so the empire of the Ethiopians stretches from Libya, literally Libya, the one that you would see today as written as the country of Libya, all the way down to Ethiopia, the one that we see today. And he says, why is this guy trying to lie and say this? And he says, and this is an accusation for life. He says that this guy is academically pointless because there is no value in what he's saying, because he changes values in the middle of a sentence and halves things when he shouldn't. And then he says it takes 3 months to travel from Garama, which is where the Garamantes come from, all the way to Ethiopia. And he says this is not true because it's so close to these areas. And remember, Garama and Ethiopia, according to modern scholars, should be this impossible part to traverse because there's the Sahara Desert. This guy is saying you could do it in way less than 3 months. And that, in fact, he makes it sound like you can do it in a couple hours or days. Everything that the modern scholars are saying is false. And the funny part is, Here's the funny part, actually, when I try to put it down in words. Um, the funny part is the only people who agree that the ancient Egyptians and Libyans and all these other people are not Ethiopians, the only people who agree with that are modern scholars. Not all of them, but modern scholars. Everyone else in history agrees that the Ethiopians are and Egyptians are the same group. But let's read on. Remember, this is Ptolemy. This is a guy in Africa. He cannot be accused of never have been in Africa. Now, before I read on, let's first look at this map that's done by the Ptolemies. You look here, you notice where it's written interior Ethiopia, that Egypt is in interior Ethiopia. And notice that the Garamantes are only to the side of Ethiopia in a place called Libya, which Libya is a province within Ethiopia. And if you look down, it's written interior Ethiopia. This would be the place where most scholars would put Ethiopia. And so they ignore the reality of this map and go, no, 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 that can't be like a real thing. So the book says Ethiopia is the whole continent of Africa, including the isthmus, by the way, which means that part of Arabia would have been considered Ethiopia and thought to inhabit Ethiopia, especially the area of the Colchians. And therefore, we see that the Greeks are steadfast on the idea that the Ethiopians are a different group. So, what should we do about this information? Well, imagine imagine if there was such glaring evidence of something in any other category. Would those scholars be respected? I want to ask you guys a question for real though. Do you respect these guys? Like even if you accuse me of being a liar or a grifter or whatever, do you understand why this evidence over here would make you not take someone seriously who's looking at this information and then concluding opposite? Like, have they never seen this before? Have they never even read this book before? What's wrong with these people? So he goes on and continues to dispute this guy, but then we're gonna skip this part that he talks about because it's irrelevant to the subject we're talking about. So let's get to the part that has to do with what we're talking about. He says in book two, first of all, therefore, let us set down Europe, which we separate from Libya by the Straits of Hercules, and from Asia after we have put in the seas and the swamp of Maetis, by the river Tanis, and by the meridians drawn through it to the unknown regions. Then let us put in Libya and place it likewise next to the sea, which extends from the bay lying near Presum, a promontory of Ethiopia, as far as the Gulf of Arabia. Keep that in mind. So Libya is placed as a presum of Ethiopia, a promontory of Ethiopia, going as far as the Gulf of Arabia. The Gulf of Arabia is that oceany area right there between Ethiopia and Arabia. That's written down. Let us separate Libya from Asia by the isthmus, which extends the interior of Hieropoliticus to our sea and separates Egypt from Arabia and Judea. You hear that again? Now, Libya, which is part of Ethiopia, according to this, is being separated from the end of Egypt, and it's being separated from Egypt to Ethiopia, to Arabia. So Egypt is considered part of Libya, and then Arabia and Judah are considered a different place. Let us do this that we may not divide Egypt in making a division of the continent by the Nile, because continents are bounded more properly where it is possible by seas than by rivers. Again, I don't want to feel like a preacher who reads one verse and then says something, but I'm going to do it. Again, it says that do not separate the continent of Africa. Ethiopia, which is the name of the continent. Libya is only a small place, but then it's also a synonym of Ethiopia. It says do not separate the continent by the Nile River. It doesn't make sense. A continent is separated by a sea. Therefore, Egypt is part of Libya or Ethiopia, if you would like. Where it is possible by seas than by rivers. In the last place, let us put Asia, keeping the same plan as in the parts of each continent of disposing of each of them according to relation to the whole earth and to the entire inhabitant region in the continent themselves, first writing in the coast that is most northern, then the western, and the seas and the islands that are nearest together, and those which is some particular or are most worthy of mention. After this, let us distinguish in the description the various prefectures and provinces of the earth, treating them as we have before noted, in accord with the known positions of localities and according to what especially ought to be inserted, spurning the multitudinous traditional farrago concerning the peculiar qualities of their different inhabitants. Now, the important part of this is this is important. It's saying that not only are the continents separate, but the people of the continent seem to share a feature, and that if you cut them in this way, you can see that okay, these people belong in this continent, these people belong in this continent, these people belong in this continent. And he will further go into this. Am I done? Not really. Now you will see that he will separate Europe from Ethiopia. Watch this. We have divided the inhabitants' region into three divisions, as seemed proper to the ancient writers who examined these areas and have left us their conclusions in their commentaries, as we ourselves desire to do, partly from what we have seen and partly from the tradition of others. We have set ourselves to depict such a map of a whole inhabited earth, presenting nothing untried concerning those things which in part are useful and can well fill the mind by giving it something which is historical, arousing, and exciting to the exercise it powers. That part of the earth which is inhabited by us is bounded on the east by the unknown land which borders on the eastern races of Greater Asia, namely the Sinai and the Ceres, and on the south by the likewise unknown land which encloses the Indian Sea and which encompasses Ethiopia. South of Libya, the country called Agasimbia, and on the west, by the unknown land encircled the Ethiopian Gulf of Libya, and by the Western Ocean bordering on the most part of Africa and Europe, and on the north by the continuous ocean called the Decaledian and Samaritan, which encompasses the British island and the northernmost parts of Europe. Okay, so basically over here he's separating and saying that Libya is separate from Europe by an ocean, and then he also says that Europe is separate from Asia by a piece of land. So they're conjoining, but there's a piece of land that separates them that makes Europe different. He says our land. Keep in mind, even though he's in Africa, when he says our land, he means his native land of Europe. And he says that Europe is separate from Libya and it's separate from Asia